turn in number 63 in your books. I'll be singing there in just a minute. I'll explain why in just a minute. Thanks again for having me to talk. I'm not a professional preacher, but I'll do the best I can. So thank you for the invite. Joe, are we shooting for 11:15
Well,
or so?
close, 11:30.
Because I'm appalled at going over. I badly went over last
No,
time. I'm not going to
we
do
are-
that again.
We're not-
I know you guys are good about it, but I do not want to go over. So I have my stopwatch going. Well, I got my stopwatch going. So, yeah, before I started, I wanted to mention that I think Al undersells himself on his song and musical ability. When Vince was having his procedure done and his heart surgery done a little while back, Al and I drove into town rather than take the train. So that means we're an hour and a half in the car going from Downingtown to the hospital downtown. So I got to hear Al's album. He has an album recorded. Let me tell you something, he's pretty good. It's pretty good. He's not quite DeShante's mom's level, but he's in the ballpark. I don't think any of us are DeShante's mom's level. So don't let him undersell you on that. He's good. He's really good at music. That's writing. Listened to some of his written songs and his guitar playing and his singing. And he could. I told him he could be the next Andy Griffith if he wanted to. So I'm leaving that.
Just like I asked you.
Thank you. Seriously though. So I was trying to think of some way to get started here, and at my request, Terry gave me her feedback as to my prior sermons. I always try to, improve on them and have some some critical input to it. And she said, "Well, you're overdoing it or done enough on the heart surgery and the flying. So I'm not allowed to use heart surgery and flying today. So instead, I'm going to use hymn 63 in the book. Let's sing the first verse real quick, and then I'll go into what I'm looking at doing here. But after singing that, let's answer the question. Do you? Do you need him every hour? Do I need him every hour? Do we look like we need him every hour? And I think too often the answer is sometimes no, it is with me. And that's what I specifically want to improve, is looking at why that is and how we can fix it. I mean, there's some obvious things, but what I'm going to start with is Luke chapter 8 and verse 43. We're going to read some people who had no hesitation about needing Jesus. And let's read that. Luke chapter 8, verse 43 and following. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. And some versions add, I'm primarily reading from the NIV today, some other versions add, she spent like her life savings trying to get this issue solved. He came up behind him, being Jesus, and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Who touched me? Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. But Jesus said, someone touched me. I know that power is gone from me. Then the woman, seeing she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. So to illustrate, it's not just only the woman who'd been spending her life looking for a solution to her infirmity or chronic infirmity is after Jesus to touch him for healing, but there's a throng. Peter says, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. It's not just her, it's this whole group of people after Jesus because they need him. And if we have an acute need, that's understandable that you're going to go to Jesus, go to God through Jesus and need him and understand that need. What if we don't have a pressing need at the moment? How do we do with that? There's a world of distractions. I mean, and not all sinful things, although there's plenty of that. But the things that just doing everyday things, getting through. Some of us do have infirmities here and there that we need to work on that slow us down. We got children to raise and protect and take care of and guide. We've got friends and neighbors that need help from us that we need to give them. So there's just a number of things. What can we do while we're waiting for the next disaster to move us towards Jesus in our vision? What can help us do that and keep that going? Well, I'd like to suggest there is an answer, and I'm going to read it from Matthew chapter 5 and verse 1. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. And he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, I think we can recognize this as the first of Jesus's first major sermon, which is scholars have kind of called the Beatitudes, if you will. And the first one is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Now, for years, I've always heard this explained by most preachers as, well, he's talking about humility here. And he goes on further down to mention it again, the blessed are the meek. And the explanation I hear a lot is, well, I don't know why Jesus mentioned it twice unless he really wanted to emphasize it, but it's the same thing. Poor in spirit is being humble. So, okay. Well, I think there's another version that I think exposes more to this idea of poor in spirit than might meet the eye. This is from a New Century version. It's not well known. It is a fully interpreted Bible from the original text. It's not a paraphrase. Let's see how they word this. They are blessed who realize their spiritual poverty, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Now, it sounds a little different to me than humility, although I can see a relationship there. My spiritual poverty and realizing it. How inherent is our spiritual poverty? What does that mean? How inherent is it? And how can that give us an appreciation for God all the time and not just part of the time? Well, I think the first step to that is looking at how God describes our spiritual poverty. And we're going to see that in detail from God himself, Romans chapter 3, starting at verse 9. What shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all, for we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. As it's written, there's no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now, this is something of an amalgamation of verses from the Old Testament, but the writer, through the Spirit, specifically pulled these ones and pulled them together in a single context. And it starts off, there is no one righteous. And the way I think of, and here today, all the people I know in this group, I don't feel this way about you, and I don't feel you're like this. Nor any church that I go to do I feel the majority or even most of the time any of them I react this way. However, I can't say that to the world at large. There are definitely people, groups, places, things that have this vibe, if you will. And if you want to see it, I don't recommend it. Just turn on the latest political talk shows and you'll get plenty of it in attitude. So this is what God sees. I think this is his description of what spiritual poverty is. And so the trick is, how do we recognize this in ourselves? And what happens when the difference in why I don't react that way to you all, and I do react that way to some parts of Philadelphia when I take the train downtown, is because we are closer to God. I mean, just the near proximity of it doesn't do it, but it gets us near his word. It gets us near his influence, especially as we study it and work together and encourage each other to get that way. The closer we are to God, the less spiritual poverty we have. And that's the imperative, is to know that we have that level of corruption and be motivated, because we'll have it all the time if we get away from God. Here's what God says happens to people when they get away from it. Romans chapter 1, backing up a few chapters. People, from chapter 1, verse 28, people do not think it was important to have a true knowledge of God. God left them and allowed them to have their own worthless thinking and to do things they should not do. They are filled with every kind of sin, evil, selfishness, and hatred. They are full of jealousy, murder, fighting, lying, and thinking the worst about each other. They gossip and say all evil things about each other. They hate God. They are rude and conceited and brag about themselves. They invent ways of doing evil. They do not obey their parents. They are foolish. They do not keep their promises, and they show no kindness or mercy to others. They know God's law says that those who live like this should die, but they themselves not only continue to do these evil things, they applaud others who do them. So the farther we get from God, the worse we behave. The closer we are to God, the better we behave. And even the atheists know this. Back around Easter time, some of you may have heard of Richard Dawkins. He's a fairly famous atheist because he gets quoted and put in the news and clipped and all that all the time. And he put out shock waves when he said at Easter, he declared himself to be a, quote, and I quote, cultural Christian. So Richard Dawkins, lifelong atheist, publicly declaring he's a cultural Christian. So I was so shockwaved by that myself. I actually looked up the interview and heard what he said for himself. And the way he explained it was, he said, so by cultural Christian, I like the trappings of Christianity. I like the Christmas carols at Christmas time. I like the fact that Christians are peaceful and I don't have to worry about them trying to take me over, invade me, or run my life because they're peaceful. I like all that thing. I just don't believe a word of it and don't want to practice it myself. That was his explanation for it. But my point is that even an atheist in a statement such as that admits from a, I think, completely or non-arguably perspective, objective perspective, that Christian influence of God on Christians is good, and the influence, when we let it influence and we seek it, counters that spiritual poverty that we come with. And it begs the question, how do we get that spiritual poverty? How did it become so bad? I think it started out that way. In Genesis, it said God made man and it was good. He declared it good. So what happened? To get the answer, let's go to Genesis. I'm going to Genesis 6 from verse 5. The Lord, this is after man sinned in the garden which was the first break from what God told him to do. The Lord saw how bad the sins of everyone on earth had become. They only thought about evil things. The Lord was very sad that he had made human beings on earth. His heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I created human beings, but I will wipe them out. I will also destroy the animals, the birds in the sky, and the creatures that move along the ground. I'm very sad that I made human beings. But he goes on the next verse to say that Noah found favor in his eyes because Noah wasn't like that. So we don't have to be like that. We don't have to give in to our spiritual corruption. That's where it came from in the garden when we started rebelling, ignoring God. That spiritual poverty within us took over. The other thing to note is notice how widespread it is. It just isn't, there aren't really any bad eggs because they were made bad eggs. We're all potentially bad eggs because we've all potentially got that spiritual poverty within us. The only answer is to seek God, find him, embrace him, be influenced to overcome that through his strength. But it starts with the blessing is real that's issued in Matthew 5 is really for those who recognize that spiritual poverty within ourselves. They know it, we accept it, and we own it. I think there's three barriers to seeing our continuous need, because that's where the real problem is. I think we don't always know how it's how bad we are, but how bad we can be when we don't have God's help to counter it. I mean, we saw how God described it, and that's people who've refused to get his help and just let that take over and run wild. I think there's three barriers, though, that even as Christians, I mean, Church of Christ, as long as you don't smoke, drink, fool around on your spouse, you can pretty much kind of show up and, doesn't always not really go any further than that. That's not necessarily inappropriate because we only correct based on what the Bible tells us to correct. We can't come up with that on our own, so that may be inappropriate. However, it doesn't mean that we're personally addressing our personal corruption to the level we need to. And we might not be able to see it because only we ourselves and God can see it and do something about it. Three barriers in our culture, our time, and just the human life in general that I think get in the way. The first one comes from a teaching of all people my dad told me. Now I know especially now that both of my parents are dead, I need to classify. You'll hear me kind of bang on my parents a lot. Um, I just want to understand there's lessons to be learned from them, and I think they're helpful to all of us when we do. I don't think they would mind me sharing these lessons to the extent I do that can help all of us learn from it and be stronger. At the same time, though, before I do, I'm not going to do that today, but I just want to mention before I talk to my dad, I've mentioned how they had a checkered Christian life until the end. It's because it took them all their lives relying on God to get where they needed to be, but they did it. Most people don't. Most people give up well before that, but my mom and dad didn't. It's the one thing they did right. It's the one thing that made the difference in their lives was never giving up. It's the main thing they taught me is no matter how bad it looks, how bad my personal spiritual poverty looks, if you don't give up and you keep grasping for God, he is going to catch you and he is going to pull you up. And there is no devil or no other person that can stop that. I know that for a fact because that's why I'm standing before you today. Now, without getting into any more details, so my dad comes up with some wisdom. Sometimes regardless of his checkered past that he's worked through to get right with God, it can be instructive. So here's what my dad's always told me. He said, don't let anybody but God through Jesus Christ himself tell you what's right or wrong. And then I added, after years, not even yourself. And what do I mean by that? Colossians 2, I'm going to go to Colossians chapter 2 and verse 16 and read. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. Do not let anyone who delights in false humility, the worship of angels, disqualify you. Such a person also goes into great detail about what they've seen. They are puffed up with idle notions by their unspiritual mind. They've lost connection with the head, from whom the whole body, supported and held together by its ligaments and sinews, grows as God causes it to grow. Thinking about different ways this can manifest itself. The way I was raised, I mean, parents are given the job of raising children, but they don't always do a good job at it or teach them the right things. That was my household growing up. Collective society, school, just phenomenon I keep hearing more and more about. Kids grow up in Christian homes, and they go off to college, and a week later they're flying the rainbow flag in their rooms and in their social lives. Why is that? Why? What caused that? Personal affinity. I don't know. I grew up in Ohio, so I guess that kind of makes me an Ohio State fan, sort of. Sorry, you Temple guys, but just where I grew up. So I had this affinity for it. But I'll tell you what, so Ohio State's big rival is Michigan. You may have heard that if you know about sports generally. And they treat each other horribly. Ohio State and Michigan fans. I've heard it's not that different. Who would it be? Alabama and Georgia, Louisiana State. When I lived in Texas, I don't know, Shante, if you remember this, at least around Austin, Texas A&M and University of Texas Austin. Oh my goodness, man, the animosity was incredible. I remember when I used to live in Austin when I was working. One of the Ohio State had played UT, University of Texas at Austin, a football game and lost to them by like a touchdown. I came into work the next day, and one of my native Texan coworkers came up to me and said, we'd have beat you by a lot more if the refs wouldn't have cheated. That was her comment. This affinity we get for sports teams, and I don't even need to use an example for politics or whatever else. Again, these are all examples in essence of somebody else telling us what to believe or what to think. And when we get so wrapped up in it that we commit to that, then we are victims of our own spiritual poverty. Second one was the second part of the wisdom from Dad, letting me tell me what is right apart from God, letting me figure it out. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 12. We do not dare to classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. So it's easy to think we're right or think we know what's right, but apart from God, it's just we're subject to the innate, whatever we think's right from wherever it came from. Most likely, if it's not from God, it's going to be some form of spiritual poverty. And then finally, personal idolatry. Colossians 3, verse 5. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. And I know that always gets talked about in the context of some kind of sexual impropriety, but it can be way, way more simple than that. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, Terry, I'm going to talk a little bit about airplanes here. I love airplanes, and the reason why I over talk about them is because I love it so much. Love flying, getting up, flying, doing it, all the stuff. But I have to really watch myself, or I can think more about that than I can about God and what I'm doing here and what I'm supposed to be doing day to day. It can fill my mind, it can fill my life if I weren't very, very careful. And sometimes it does, fortunately, only temporarily. But and it's called idolatry, and it rightly is said so. So it doesn't have to be something that's socially dramatic. It can be something that everybody thinks is fine. but we ourselves and God know for sure. Final thoughts. So I hope this lesson's been helpful in at least jogging our minds as to number one, we are inherently, since the day we were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, subject to a spiritual poverty within our own souls. And that's every one of us. Nobody's special and nobody's exempted. The only difference in letting that take hold of us versus not is how relentlessly we pursue God, pursue His word, and pursue His lifestyle through our word. And that makes the difference. Final verse to hopefully cement that and help keep it in mind. Colossians chapter 3, verse 1 through 4. This is just before verse 5 that I read. Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Thank you very much for the invitation to come, and I hope that's helpful, and I hope you have a great rest of your day looking for God. Thank you.